The candles in the ballroom of Corwood House had burned low, and Duke Nathaniel Ashcombe was already counting the minutes until he could leave his own party. Across the polished floor, Lady Cordelia Marsh stood waiting for him with her fan pressed to her chest, and her eyes bright with expectation. She was the 30th woman he had courted in 10 years, and like the 29 before her, she was about to become his past. He crossed the room slowly, aware of every eye upon him. The guests always watched when the Duke of Corwood approached a lady he had been courting. They watched because they wanted to see which way it would end. It always ended the same way. "Lady Cordelia," he said, bowing just enough to satisfy propriety and no more. "May I have a word with you in private?" Her smile faltered, just slightly, as though she already knew. She had heard the stories, surely. Everyone in London had heard the stories of the Duke who courted beautiful, accomplished women, and then discarded them without warning, without cruelty, but also without any explanation that satisfied. They stepped onto the terrace, away from the music and the chatter. The night air was cool, and the stars hung low over the gardens of Corwood House. "I believe," he said, choosing his words the way he chose everything, with careful and practiced distance, "that we should end our arrangement. You are a fine woman, Lady Cordelia. You will make an excellent wife to someone who deserves you." "But not to you," she said quietly. "No," he admitted, "not to me." She did not cry. She did not argue. She simply nodded, gathered the remains of her dignity, and walked back into the ballroom, leaving him alone with the stars and the silence he had grown so used to. He told himself, as he always did, that it was better this way, better to end things cleanly than to marry a woman he did not truly want, simply because society expected him to marry someone eventually. He was 34 years old. He had wealth enough for 3 lifetimes, land that stretched further than most counties, and a title that made mothers push their daughters toward him like offerings at an altar. What he did not have, and had begun to suspect he never would, was any feeling strong enough to outlast a season. He turned to go back inside, already composing the excuse he would give his aunt for retiring early, when a voice stopped him. "You did that rather well," the voice said. "Practice, I suppose." He turned sharply. A young woman stood near the balustrade, half hidden by the shadow of a large stone urn filled with flowers. She had clearly witnessed the entire exchange. She was not one of his usual crowd of admirers. He did not recognize her at all, and he prided himself on remembering every face that mattered in London society. "I beg your pardon," he said, his voice cooling into the tone he used for impertinence. "I do not believe we have been introduced." "No," she agreed, "we have not. And judging by what I just watched, I am not certain I wish to be." He should have walked away. He usually did, when someone spoke to him with that kind of boldness. Instead, he found himself studying her more closely. She wore a simple gown, well made but without the excessive decoration favored by the young ladies inside. Her dark hair was pinned back plainly, without the elaborate curls that took maids hours to arrange. And her eyes, when they met his, did not drop away the way every other woman's eyes did. "You find something amusing," he said. "I find something sad," she corrected. "That poor woman believed, for however many weeks you allowed her to believe it, that she mattered to you. And you ended it on a terrace, between 2 dances, as though you were canceling an appointment with your tailor." Heat rose in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation, for he was rarely spoken to this way. "You know nothing of the matter. I know what I saw," she said simply. "And I know that you have done this by my count, 30 times now. My aunt keeps a rather detailed accounting of your courtships. She finds it fascinating. I find it exhausting, simply from watching. Your aunt sounds like she has too much time on her hands." "She does," the young woman agreed, without any offense in her voice. "As, apparently, do you, Your Grace. If you can spare 10 courtships a year, and still have energy left over to insult strangers on terraces." He almost laughed. It caught him entirely by surprise, the urge rising in his throat before he could stop it, and he covered it by clearing his throat instead. No one spoke to him this way. No one dared. "Who are you?" he asked, and this time the question held genuine curiosity rather than irritation. "Miss Eleanor Hartley," she said. "I am here because my aunt insisted, and because the punch, I am told, is very good. I have no interest in dukes, courtships, or 31 attempts at love. I only wished for some air." "Then I have interrupted you." "You have," she agreed, "though I confess, it has been the most interesting part of the evening so far." She dropped a small, correct curtsy, one that held not a trace of the eagerness he was used to, and turned to walk back toward the doors. He watched her go, unable to account for why he did not simply let the moment pass, why his feet carried him a step closer instead. "Miss Hartley," he called. She paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "Will you be attending the Ashworth ball next week?" Something like amusement flickered across her face. "Are you asking because you wish to see me again, Your Grace, or because you cannot bear that I did not curtsy to your title the way every other woman in that ballroom does?" He opened his mouth to answer and found, for the first time and longer than he could remember, that he did not have a ready reply. "Both, perhaps," he admitted. "Honest," she said, sounding almost surprised. "That is new, from what I hear of you. I am full of surprises, Miss Hartley." "We shall see," she said, and this time she did not wait for his response before disappearing back into the light and noise of the ballroom, leaving him standing alone on the terrace with the stars, the silence, and a feeling he could not quite name pressing uncomfortably against his chest. Inside, the orchestra began a new set, and somewhere among the crowd, Lady Cordelia was already dancing with another gentleman, her composure fully restored, her heart, he hoped, only lightly bruised. He would send flowers tomorrow. He always sent flowers. It was, he had come to believe, the only apology he knew how to give. He lingered outside a while longer, turning the strange conversation over in his mind. In 10 years of courtships, no woman had ever spoken to him the way Eleanor Hartley just had. They flattered him. They agreed with him. They laughed at things that were not amusing and admired things that did not deserve admiration, all because he held a title that could change the whole shape of their futures. He had grown so accustomed to being agreed with that he had nearly forgotten what it felt like to be challenged. He did not enjoy it, precisely, but he could not stop thinking about it either. When he finally returned to the ballroom, his aunt, Lady Prudence Ashcombe, caught his arm at once, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "You ended things with Lady Cordelia," she said. "It was not a question." "I did." "That is 30, Nathaniel." "I am aware of the number, Aunt." She studied him with the particular expression she reserved for moments when she suspected he was hiding something. "You look different tonight. Did something happen on that terrace?" He glanced across the room, searching without quite meaning to, until he found Eleanor Hartley standing near the refreshment table, speaking with an older woman who was undoubtedly the aunt with the detailed accounting. Eleanor was not looking at him. She seemed entirely uninterested in whether he was looking at her at all, which, he realized with some discomfort, was precisely why he could not stop. "Nothing happened," he said. "I met someone who does not care for dukes." Lady Prudence raised an eyebrow, following his gaze until she too found Eleanor Hartley across the room. A slow, knowing smile spread across her face, the kind of smile that made him deeply uneasy. "How refreshing," she said. "Perhaps, Nathaniel, that is exactly what you need." He said nothing, because he did not trust himself to argue with her, and because some small, stubborn part of him suspected that she might be right. Later that night, long after the guests had gone and the candles had been snuffed out one by tired servants, Nathaniel sat alone in his study with a glass of brandy he had no real interest in drinking. The house was quiet in the way great houses become quiet after a party, filled with the faint smell of melted wax and crushed flowers, echoing slightly with the memory of music that had already faded. He thought of the 30 women who had come before Eleanor Hartley. He could recall their names if he tried, though their faces had begun to blur together over the years, each one polished and pleasant and eager to please, each one nodding at whatever he said, laughing at whatever he found dull, agreeing that the weather was fine and the company was fine, and he himself was the finest man in the room. He had believed, for a long while, that this was simply what courtship was, a performance both parties understood and accepted, until one side or the other grew tired of performing. He had never once been told, so plainly and without flattery, that his behavior was sad. The word stayed with him. Sad. Not cruel, not shameful, not scandalous, though society would have used any of those words gladly if given the chance. Sad was worse, somehow. Cruelty could be defended. Sadness could not. He rose from his chair and crossed to the window, looking out over the dark gardens where, only hours earlier, Eleanor Hartley had stood watching him end another courtship with the same practiced ease he used for signing correspondence. He tried to imagine what she must have thought of him in that moment, and found that he did not like the picture his imagination produced. For 10 years, he had told himself a simple story about his own life. He was a duke who had not yet found a woman capable of holding his interest for longer than a season. The fault, in this story, always belonged to the women who came and went, never quite clever enough, never quite genuine enough, never quite anything enough to make him want to stay. It was a comfortable story. It required nothing of him. But standing at the window with the taste of brandy still on his tongue, he allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, to wonder whether the story he told himself was entirely true. He thought of Lady Cordelia's face on the terrace, the small flicker of hurt she had tried so hard to hide. He thought of the 29 women before her, whose faces he could barely recall, though he was certain each of them had worn that same expression at least once, in some room, on some night, when he had decided, quietly and without much thought, that they were not enough to keep. Perhaps, he thought, the fault was not always theirs. He did not enjoy the thought. It sat uncomfortably in his chest, the way Eleanor Hartley's words had sat uncomfortably on the terrace, refusing to be dismissed, no matter how firmly he tried. He finished his brandy and set the glass aside, unfinished business weighing more heavily on him than he wished to admit. Tomorrow, he would send flowers to Lady Cordelia, as he always did. But tonight, for the first time in 10 years of courtships that ended in the same quiet, practiced way, Nathaniel Ashcombe found himself thinking not of the woman he had just left, but of the one who had watched him leave her, and had judged him for it without a single ounce of flattery to soften the blow. He did not know when he would see Eleanor Hartley again. He only knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that he intended to. Eleanor Hartley did not think of Duke Nathaniel Ashcombe again until 3 days later, when a letter arrived at her aunt's townhouse bearing a seal she recognized at once, pressed into wax the color of dried blood. She turned the letter over in her hands, unopened, while her aunt, Mrs. Beatrice Farrow, watched her with barely contained delight from across the breakfast table. "Well," Beatrice said, "are you going to open it, or shall I do it for you?" "It is likely nothing," Eleanor said, though her fingers had already begun working at the seal. "Some formality. Dukes are very fond of formalities." The letter was short. It requested the pleasure of Miss Hartley's company at a private luncheon at Corwood House the following Thursday, to discuss a matter of some importance regarding her late father's business interests. Nothing more. No flowery language, no false warmth, simply a request stated plainly, as though he had written it the same way he ended courtships, with efficient and practiced distance. "A matter of business," Eleanor read aloud, frowning. "What business could the Duke of Corwood possibly have with my father's affairs? Father has been gone 3 years, and his interests were modest at best." Beatrice's eyes narrowed with interest. "Your father held shares in several trading ventures before he died, did he not? Perhaps the Duke has some connection there." Eleanor did not know, and the not knowing troubled her more than she wished to admit. She had spent the 3 years since her father's death managing what little remained of his estate herself, refusing the various relatives who had offered, with varying degrees of sincerity, to take the burden from her shoulders. She kept the books herself, she corresponded with solicitors herself. She had grown fiercely protective of her independence, precisely because so many people seemed eager to relieve her of it, usually for reasons that served themselves rather than her. She was not a woman who trusted convenient letters from powerful men. Still, she found herself at Corwood House the following Thursday, dressed plainly but neatly, her chin lifted in the particular way she wore like armor whenever she entered a room full of people who assumed her circumstances made her lesser. The Duke received her not in a grand drawing room designed to overwhelm, but in a smaller study lined with books and maps, a fire crackling low in the grate. He rose when she entered, which surprised her slightly, and gestured to a chair across from his desk rather than seating her at a distance meant to emphasize his rank. "Miss Hartley," he said, "thank you for coming. Your letter mentioned my father's business interests," she said, declining to waste time on pleasantries. "I confess I am curious what those could possibly have to do with you." He studied her for a moment before answering, and she had the distinct sense that he was deciding how much honesty the conversation required. "Your father held shares in a shipping venture," he said, "one that unfortunately has recently come under scrutiny for irregularities in its accounts. I have interests in the same venture, considerably larger than your father's, and I have reason to believe the losses being reported to shareholders do not match the actual state of the company's finances. You suspect fraud. I suspect it strongly. I cannot yet prove it." Eleanor sat back slightly, turning this over. "And you believe I can help you prove it?" "I believe your father kept meticulous records," he said. "I have made some inquiries, Miss Hartley, and I understand you have managed his estate yourself since his death, rather than handing the task to a solicitor or a male relative, as most women in your position would do. I am told you understand figures better than most men of business I have met." She did not know whether to be flattered or suspicious, and settled somewhere uncomfortably between the two. "You have been asking questions about me." "I have," he admitted without any apology in his voice. "I find I am curious about people who refuse to flatter me on terraces." Despite herself, the corner of her mouth twitched. "That is not an answer to my concern, Your Grace." "No," he agreed. "It is not. But it is the truth, and I find I would rather give you the truth than a comfortable lie, given that you seem entirely unimpressed by comfortable lies." She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the practiced charm she had watched him deploy so effortlessly on the terrace with Lady Cordelia. She did not find it. What she found instead was something closer to genuine uncertainty, as though he was navigating this conversation without the usual script he relied upon, and did not entirely trust himself to get it right. "What is it you actually want from me?" she asked. "Your father's records, if you still have them, and your assistance in reviewing the venture's public accounts alongside them, to see where the numbers diverge. I would pay you for your time, of course, as I would pay any man of business I engaged for the same purpose. You wish to hire me. I wish to compensate you fairly for work I believe you are more capable of performing than half the men I could hire in London," he said. "If that troubles your sense of propriety, Miss Hartley, I apologize. But I did not think you were a woman overly concerned with propriety, given our first conversation." This time she did laugh, a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch them both off guard. "You are correct. I am not particularly concerned with propriety, though I imagine my aunt would disagree." "Then we understand each other." "We understand very little of each other, Your Grace," she said. "But I confess, this is a considerably more interesting proposal than I expected when I opened your letter." They spent the next hour bent over the venture's public accounts, spread across his desk alongside notes he had made in a hand that was surprisingly untidy for a man so composed in every other respect. Eleanor found herself forgetting, gradually, that she was sitting across from a duke at all. He asked her opinion and listened to her answers without the polite, dismissive nodding she had grown used to from men who asked women questions only to demonstrate their own generosity in asking. When she disagreed with his interpretation of a column of figures, he did not bristle or insist upon his own reading. He simply asked her to explain her reasoning, and when she did, he reconsidered his position entirely. It was, she realized with some discomfort, the first time in longer than she could remember, that a man of consequence had treated her judgment as though it mattered as much as his own. "You will need my father's records," she said eventually, gathering her gloves as the afternoon light began to fade through the study windows. "I can have them sent over by the end of the week." "I would rather not trouble you to send them," he said. "Would you object to bringing them yourself? I find I work through figures more efficiently with someone to argue with, and you seem unusually willing to argue." "That sounds suspiciously like an invitation dressed up as a business necessity, Your Grace." "Perhaps," he said, and there was something almost boyish in the small, unguarded smile that crossed his face, so different from the composed expression he wore in public. "Is that a problem?" "It might be," she said honestly. "I have heard a great deal about you, Your Grace, and very little of it involves a man who values a woman's mind over her willingness to admire him." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of the same discomfort she had noticed on the terrace, as though her honesty struck closer to a wound than she realized. "I am aware of my reputation, Miss Hartley. I have earned every part of it. I do not ask you to trust me. I ask only that you help me uncover the truth about this venture, for your father's sake as much as my own interests." She considered him for a long moment, weighing the sincerity in his voice against everything she had heard whispered about him in ballrooms and over tea. In the end, it was not his title or his wealth that decided her, but the simple fact that he had listened to her, truly listened, in a way so few men ever bothered to do. "Very well," she said. "I will bring the records myself, but I warn you, Your Grace, I intend to argue with every figure that does not satisfy me." "I would expect nothing less," he said, and as she left Corwood House that afternoon, stepping into the cool evening air, with her father's memory pressing gently against her thoughts, she found herself, against every instinct of caution she possessed, looking forward to their next meeting, far more than she cared to admit. Behind her, in the quiet study with its dying fire, Nathaniel Ashcombe sat for a long while without moving, staring at the door through which she had just departed. 30 women had passed through his life in 10 years, each one eager to please him, each one forgotten within a season. Eleanor Hartley had spent an entire afternoon disagreeing with him, correcting him, refusing to soften her opinions for his comfort, and he could not recall the last time he had felt so thoroughly, uncomfortably alive. That evening, Eleanor returned to her aunt's townhouse to find Beatrice waiting in the sitting room with an expression that suggested she had been waiting there for some time, embroidery abandoned in her lap. "Well?" Beatrice demanded, before Eleanor had even removed her bonnet. "What did the Duke want with your father's business?" Eleanor explained as briefly as she could. though Beatrice's eyebrows climbed higher with every sentence, until they had nearly disappeared beneath the edge of her cap. "He wishes to hire you," Beatrice said when Eleanor had finished, "as though you were a clerk." "He wishes to compensate me fairly for work he believes I can do well," Eleanor corrected. "There is a difference, Aunt, though I understand why you might not see it immediately." "I see a duke inventing excuses to spend time with a young woman who has no fortune and no particular interest in marrying him," Beatrice said, not unkindly. "I have watched this game before, Eleanor, though never quite played this way. Usually it is the young woman inventing excuses to be near the duke, not the reverse." "It is not a game," Eleanor said, though even as she spoke the words, she felt a small flicker of uncertainty about whether that was entirely true. "He genuinely suspects fraud in a venture that affects real people, myself included, given the shares my father left me. If I can help uncover the truth, I intend to, regardless of what conclusions you draw about his motives." Beatrice studied her niece for a long moment, and something softened in her expression. "You liked him," she said, "despite everything you have heard." "I do not know what I think of him yet," Eleanor admitted. "He is not what I expected. He listens, Aunt, in a way I have rarely seen from men of his standing. He asked my opinion on the figures and then actually considered it, rather than simply waiting for me to finish speaking so he could return to his own conclusions. That is a low standard to be impressed by, my dear." "It is," Eleanor agreed with a small, rueful laugh. "Which perhaps says more about the men I have known than it does about the Duke of Corwood." Beatrice reached over and patted her hand, her expression turning thoughtful rather than teasing for the first time that evening. "Your father would have liked that about him, I think. He always said the measure of a man was not what he said in company, but how carefully he listened when someone disagreed with him." Eleanor said nothing to that, though the mention of her father settled heavily in her chest, the way it always did when Beatrice spoke of him so plainly. She missed him fiercely still, missed the quiet hours they had spent together over ledgers and correspondence, missed the steady, patient way he had taught her to understand figures long before society decided such knowledge was unbecoming in a young woman. It was strange, and not entirely comfortable, to think that her father's memory had led her, however indirectly, into the private study of a duke with a reputation for discarding women as easily as he discarded stale bread. She rose from her chair and crossed to the window, looking out at the darkening street below, much as Nathaniel Ashcombe had looked out over his own gardens 3 nights before, though she did not know this, and would not have believed it if told. "I will bring the records to Corwood House at the end of the week," she said, more to herself than to her aunt, "and I will help him uncover whatever truth lies in those accounts, for my father's sake, and for my own. Whatever else comes of it, Aunt, I intend to keep my wits about me. I have watched enough of his courtships end in tears on ballroom terraces. I do not intend to become the 31st entry in that particular ledger." Beatrice smiled, a small, knowing smile that Eleanor did not entirely trust. "Of course not, my dear," she said. "Of course not." But long after Eleanor had retired for the night, Beatrice remained in the sitting room, turning her embroidery over in her hands without truly seeing it, thinking of the careful way her niece had spoken of the Duke's habit of listening, and wondering, not for the first time that evening, whether Eleanor Hartley already understood far less about her own heart than she believed she did. By the 3rd week of their arrangement, Eleanor Hartley had become a familiar sight at Corwood House, arriving twice weekly with her father's ledgers tucked beneath her arm, her bonnet slightly askew from the carriage ride, and an expression that made it clear she had come prepared to argue. Nathaniel found himself looking forward to those afternoons with an intensity that unsettled him. He told himself it was the puzzle that drew him, the slow, methodical work of tracing discrepancies through columns of figures until the shape of the fraud began to emerge. But he knew, even as he told himself this story, that it was not entirely true. It was Eleanor herself, the way she frowned at a column that did not balance, the way she refused to accept his conclusions simply because he held a title, the way she laughed, rare and startled, when he made some dry observation about the venture's increasingly absurd excuses for its losses. "Here," she said one afternoon, tapping a figure with the end of her pen. "This entry does not match the shipping manifest my father recorded in March. The company claims to have lost an entire cargo of cotton to weather damage, but my father's notes say the ship arrived in port 3 days later, fully loaded." Nathaniel leaned over the desk to examine the entry, close enough that he caught the faint scent of lavender water in her hair. He straightened quickly, clearing his throat. "Your father was thorough." "My father trusted numbers more than he trusted people," Eleanor said, a small, fond smile touching her mouth. "And he used to say that figures do not flatter, and they do not lie, provided you know how to read them honestly." A wise man. He was, she agreed. I miss him rather a great deal, though I try not to speak of it too often. It tends to make people uncomfortable. It does not make me uncomfortable, Nathaniel said, and meant it. I find I would rather hear the truth of what you feel than the comfortable version most people prefer to offer. She glanced up at him, something searching in her expression. You say that a great deal, Your Grace, that you prefer truth to comfort. I have spent 10 years surrounded by people who offer me nothing but comfort, he said. Comfortable conversation, comfortable agreement, comfortable admiration. I have grown rather tired of it, if I am honest. Is that why you ended things with Lady Cordelia, and the 29 before her? The question landed more directly than he expected, and he found himself answering honestly before he had fully decided to. I ended things with all of them because none of them ever disagreed with me. Not once, not about anything, not even trivial matters like which play to attend or which restaurant served the better soup. I began to wonder, somewhere around the 10th or 11th, whether they had opinions at all, or whether they had simply learned that agreeing with a duke was the surest path to becoming a duchess. And you found that unbearable. I found it lonely, he said, and the word surprised him even as he spoke it, because he had never said it aloud before, not even to himself. I have been lonely for a very long time, Miss Hartley, surrounded by people who wanted something from me, but very few who wanted to know me. Eleanor set down her pen, studying him with an expression that had lost its usual sharpness, replaced by something gentler, more careful. That is the most honest thing you have said to me since we met. I find myself saying a great many honest things around you, he admitted. It is rather inconvenient, given how carefully I have avoided honesty for most of my adult life. She laughed then, soft and genuine, and he found himself smiling in return, an easy, unguarded expression that felt strange on his own face, as though he were using muscles that had gone unused for years. They worked through the afternoon in comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional exchange over a disputed figure, until the light through the study windows had turned amber with the approach of evening. Eleanor gathered her things reluctantly, and Nathaniel found himself reluctant to let her go, though he did not say so aloud. There is a charity concert next week, he said instead, as she pulled on her gloves. At the Hartwell estate. My aunt has been badgering me to attend for a month, and I find the prospect considerably more bearable if you were to come as well. Eleanor paused, glancing at him with a wary expression. Are you asking me to accompany you, Your Grace, or asking me to attend the same event you happen to be attending? I am asking you to accompany me, he said, deciding that honesty, having served him so well thus far, deserved to be extended even here, though I understand if you would rather not. I am aware of what people will say, if the Duke of Corwood is seen escorting a woman with no fortune and no particular interest in becoming his 31st courtship. You have been listening to gossip about yourself. I have ears, Miss Hartley. I cannot help but hear what is said around me, even when I would rather not. She considered him for a long moment, and he found himself holding his breath, waiting for her answer with an eagerness that embarrassed him slightly, given how carefully he usually guarded his own composure. I will come, she said finally. Though I warn you, Your Grace, I have no interest in playing the role people will assume I am playing. I am not auditioning to become the next Duchess of Corwood. I am accompanying a man I find, against my better judgment, rather good company. That is more than I have earned from most of London, he said. I will take it gladly. The following week, the Hartwell estate glowed with lantern light as carriages arrived in a steady procession, depositing London's finest families onto the gravel drive. Eleanor arrived on Nathaniel's arm, aware of the whispers that followed them from the moment they stepped through the doors, aware of the sharp, assessing glances from mothers who had spent years maneuvering their own daughters toward the Duke's attention. They are staring, she murmured, as they made their way toward the concert hall. They are always staring, he said. I stopped noticing years ago. I have not had the practice. You will, he said, and something in his tone suggested he intended for that practice to continue, an implication that sent a small, unwelcome flutter through her chest. They took seats near the back of the hall, and Eleanor found herself grateful for the relative privacy, away from the most curious eyes. The concert began, a program of chamber music that Nathaniel seemed to genuinely enjoy, his usual guarded composure softening into something more open as the music filled the room. During the interval, as guests mingled in the adjoining salon, Eleanor found herself approached by a woman she did not recognize, elegantly dressed, with cold, assessing eyes that reminded her uncomfortably of a hawk surveying a field. Miss Hartley, the woman said, her smile not reaching her eyes, I understand you have been spending a great deal of time at Corwood House. Assisting with business matters, I am told. That is correct, Eleanor said carefully. How resourceful of you, the woman said. Though I confess, I find it rather curious that a woman of your circumstances should find herself so frequently in the Duke's company. One might almost think you were angling for something rather more permanent than a business arrangement. Heat rose in Eleanor's cheeks, though she kept her expression carefully composed. I am not certain what you are implying, madam. I imply nothing, the woman said, with the particular sweetness that made the words all the more cutting. I simply observe that His Grace has courted 30 women in 10 years, each one more suitable than the last, and each one discarded within a season. I would hate to see you invest your hopes in a man who has proven, quite thoroughly, that he does not know how to stay. Before Eleanor could form a response, Nathaniel appeared at her side, his expression cool and composed, though something hard had entered his eyes. Lady Winterbourne, he said, I did not realize you were acquainted with Miss Hartley. We were merely becoming acquainted, Your Grace, Lady Winterbourne said, unbothered by his tone. I was simply offering some friendly counsel. Miss Hartley requires no counsel regarding my character, Nathaniel said. She has formed her own opinions, considerably more accurate ones than most, I might add, and I would ask that you refrain from offering advice that was not sought. Lady Winterbourne's smile thinned, but she inclined her head and moved away, disappearing back into the crowd with the practiced grace of a woman who had delivered her intended wound and considered the matter closed. I am sorry, Nathaniel said quietly, once she had gone. London is full of people who enjoy watching others struggle. I should have warned you more clearly what to expect. I am not so easily wounded, Your Grace, Eleanor said, though her voice carried less certainty than her words. Though I confess, her observation was not entirely without merit. You have courted 30 women, and ended things with each of them. I would be a fool not to wonder whether I am simply the 31st in a pattern I have watched play out from a terrace. You are not, he said, with a quiet firmness that surprised them both. I have never once brought any of those 30 women to review business accounts with me. I have never once told any of them that I was lonely. I have never once wanted, as fiercely as I want now, for someone to disagree with me, simply because their honesty matters more than my comfort. Eleanor said nothing for a long moment, searching his face in the dim light of the salon, looking for the practiced charm she had watched him wield so effortlessly on that first terrace, and finding, instead, something that looked remarkably like fear, carefully masked beneath his composure. I do not know what to do with that, Your Grace, she said finally, honestly. I did not come to London to fall in love with a duke who cannot seem to keep a woman past a single season. Neither did I intend to fall in love with a woman who refuses to curtsy to my title, he said, and the words hung between them, unplanned and unguarded, the first time either of them had spoken the word aloud. The music resumed in the hall beyond, calling guests back to their seats, but neither of them moved for a long moment, caught in the strange, uncertain space between what had been said and what still remained unspoken, both of them aware that something had shifted between them that could not easily be undone. We should return to our seats, Eleanor said finally, though she made no immediate move to do so. We should, Nathaniel agreed, equally motionless. Neither of them laughed at the absurdity of it, though a smaller version of Eleanor, watching from some detached corner of her own mind, wanted to. They stood there in the emptying salon, the last stragglers filing back toward the concert hall, and she found herself studying his face in a way she had carefully avoided until now, taking in the sharp line of his jaw, the faint crease between his brows that appeared whenever he was thinking too hard, the way his composure, so carefully maintained in every other setting, seemed to dissolve entirely whenever he spoke to her without an audience. Lady Winterbourne will tell everyone she knows what she overheard, Eleanor said. By tomorrow morning, half of London will believe I am the newest candidate for Duchess of Corwood. Does that trouble you? It should, she said. I have spent 3 years building a life that depends on no one's opinion of me but my own. I do not relish the thought of becoming a subject of gossip in drawing rooms I have never even visited. I could speak to her, Nathaniel offered. Ask her to hold her tongue. That would only make it worse, Eleanor said, with a small, tired laugh. A duke defending a woman's reputation is precisely the sort of thing that confirms every suspicion Lady Winterbourne already holds. No, I think it is better to simply let it pass, as gossip usually does, once something more interesting arrives to replace it. You are remarkably practical, Miss Hartley. I have had to be, she said. My father left me very little beyond his good name and a handful of shares in a venture that now appears to be fraudulent. I could not afford to be anything but practical, Your Grace, if I wished to keep my independence. Something in her tone, matter of fact and unflinching, struck him more forcefully than any of Lady Winterbourne's carefully aimed cruelties had managed. He had spent his entire life surrounded by wealth so vast he rarely thought of it at all, while Eleanor Hartley had spent 3 years counting every shilling, managing every ledger, protecting every scrap of independence she possessed against relatives and circumstances that seemed determined to strip it from her. "I admire that about you," he said quietly. "More than I know how to say properly. You seem to manage saying a great many things properly, Your Grace, for a man who claims otherwise." "Only around you," he admitted. "I find I have very little composure left where you are concerned, Miss Hartley, though I confess I am not entirely certain when that happened." She did not answer immediately, and for a moment he feared he had said too much, moved too quickly, frightened away the fragile thing that had begun to grow between them over ledgers and disputed figures. But when she finally spoke, her voice was soft, without its usual guardedness. "I am not entirely certain either," she said, "which frightens me rather more than Lady Winterbourne's gossip ever could." They returned to their seats as the second half of the concert began, sitting close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, neither of them paying much attention to the music that filled the hall around them. Eleanor was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the warmth of him, the careful, deliberate way he seemed to be holding himself still, as though any sudden movement might shatter something delicate that had settled between them. When the concert ended and guests began filing out into the cool night air, Nathaniel offered his arm to escort her to the carriage, and she took it without hesitation, a small gesture that felt, to both of them, considerably larger than it should have. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said, as they waited for her carriage to be brought around. "Thank you for defending me," she said, "even if you believe it did not help." "I would defend you again," he said, "regardless of whether it helps." The carriage arrived before either of them could say more, and Eleanor climbed inside, pausing at the door to glance back at him one final time. He stood beneath the lantern light, tall and composed and entirely unlike the cold, distant figure London gossiped about, and she found herself, against every careful instinct she had built over 3 years of guarding her own heart, wishing the evening did not have to end. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. "Good night, Miss Hartley," he replied, and watched the carriage pull away into the darkness, standing there long after it had disappeared from view, turning over in his mind everything that had been said, and everything that had not, and finding, to his own considerable surprise, that he did not want to let a single moment of the evening go. The letter that arrived at Corwood House 3 days after the Hartwell concert was not sealed with the careful wax Nathaniel usually received from his solicitor. It came instead from the offices of the shipping venture itself, and its contents made his blood run cold before he had even finished the first paragraph. The board of the venture, it seemed, had learned of his private inquiries into their accounts. Rather than address the discrepancies directly, they had chosen instead to accuse him publicly of attempting to manipulate the company's share price through false rumors of fraud, a charge that, if believed, could damage not only his own reputation but drag Eleanor's name into a scandal she had done nothing to deserve. He read the letter twice, then a third time, his jaw tightening with each pass. They had named her directly, describing her as his accomplice in spreading falsehoods, a detail clearly meant to frighten him into silence by threatening the one person he had, without quite realizing it, come to care for more than his own standing in society. He was still standing in his study, the letter crumpled in his fist, when his aunt found him. "Nathaniel," Lady Prudence said, alarm creeping into her voice at the sight of his expression. "What has happened?" He handed her the letter without a word, watching her face darken as she read. "They cannot possibly believe this will work," she said, when she finished. "It is a transparent attempt to frighten you into silence." "It is working," he admitted. "Not because I fear for my own reputation, Aunt, but because I have dragged Eleanor into danger she never asked for. She came to me for her father's memory, to help uncover a truth that concerned her own modest inheritance, and now she finds herself accused of conspiracy in a public letter that half of London will have read by morning." "Then you must act swiftly," Prudence said, "before the accusation spreads further." "I intend to," he said, though the resolve in his voice did not entirely mask the fear beneath it. "But I fear the damage to Eleanor's reputation may already be beyond repair, regardless of what I do now." He was proven right within a day. By the time he called at Beatrice Farrow's townhouse the following afternoon, Eleanor had already heard the whispers circulating through London's drawing rooms, carried on the same swift currents of gossip that had once spread word of his 30 courtships. She received him in the small parlor, her face pale but composed, her hands folded tightly in her lap in a way that betrayed more distress than her expression allowed. "You have heard, then," he said, seating himself across from her. I have heard a great deal, she said. That I conspired with you to spread false rumors about a respectable shipping venture. That I am, depending on which account one believes, either your accomplice or your latest conquest, angling for a fortune I have no legitimate claim to. It is remarkable, Your Grace, how quickly an entire narrative can be constructed from nothing at all. I am sorry, he said, and the words felt woefully insufficient even as he spoke them. This is my doing, Eleanor. I should never have involved you in this matter, knowing the risk it might carry. Do not apologize for treating me as capable of contributing something real, she said, sharper than he expected. I chose to help you, Nathaniel. I am not so fragile that I require protection from the consequences of my own decisions. The use of his given name, unplanned and unguarded, startled them both into a brief silence. Nevertheless, he said finally, I intend to correct this. I have already instructed my solicitor to gather every record we have compiled, every discrepancy we have found, and present it to the appropriate authorities before the Ventures Board can spread their falsehoods any further. And if it is not enough, if the accusation against me stands regardless of what evidence you produce. He did not have a ready answer, and his silence stretched long enough that Eleanor rose from her chair and crossed to the window, much as she had done that first evening after their business arrangement began, staring out at a street she was not truly seeing. I have spent 3 years protecting my independence, she said quietly, guarding my reputation as carefully as I guarded my father's ledgers, because I understood, better than most, how quickly a woman's good name can be taken from her by men who have no real stake in the truth. And now, because I chose to trust you, because I chose to believe that honesty mattered more than caution, I find myself facing precisely the ruin I spent 3 years trying to avoid. Eleanor, I am not blaming you, she said, turning back to face him, though her eyes were bright with something that might have been anger, or might have been tears, he could not tell which. I chose this. I would choose it again, knowing what I know now, because the fraud we uncovered is real, and it deserves to be exposed regardless of the cost to either of us. But I need you to understand what that cost might be for me, Nathaniel. In a way, it will never be for you. You are a duke. Scandal clings to men of your rank for a season, perhaps 2, before society forgives and forgets. I have no title to shield me. I have only my name, and my name is very nearly all I have left. He rose and crossed the room to stand before her, close enough that he could see the fine tremor in her hands, carefully hidden beneath her folded arms. Then I will not let it be taken from you, he said. Whatever it costs me, Eleanor, I will not allow your name to be destroyed for the sin of helping me uncover a truth that needed uncovering. How? She asked. How do you intend to stop an entire board of powerful men from spreading whatever story serves them best? By making the truth impossible to ignore, he said, and by standing beside you publicly, so thoroughly and so visibly that no one can credibly claim you acted as anything other than what you are, a woman of intelligence and integrity who helped expose a fraud that would have harmed hundreds of investors, myself included. That would mean declaring yourself publicly, she said slowly, understanding dawning in her expression, attaching your name to mine in a way that cannot be undone. Yes, he said simply. You have spent 10 years avoiding precisely that kind of declaration, Nathaniel. 30 women, and you never once stood beside any of them publicly enough to silence gossip on their behalf. None of them were worth the risk, he said. You are. The words hung in the air between them, simple and unadorned, without any of the practiced charm he had once used so effortlessly to win the affections of women who meant nothing to him. Eleanor searched his face for any trace of performance, any hint that this was simply another version of the man who had ended 30 courtships with the same cool detachment, and found none. I am frightened, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, not of the scandal, not truly. I am frightened of how much I have come to care for you, Nathaniel, and how little that seems to matter against the weight of everything working to keep us apart. I am frightened too, he said, and the admission seemed to cost him something, though he did not look away from her as he said it. I have spent 10 years believing myself incapable of feeling anything strong enough to last beyond a season. You have proven that belief entirely wrong, and I do not know what to do with the fear that follows from that, except to tell you the truth of it, plainly, and hope that it is enough. She reached out then, her hand finding his, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, standing together in the quiet parlor while outside, London continued its steady churn of gossip and speculation, entirely unaware that the man at the center of 30 failed courtships had finally found something he did not intend to let go. We will face this together then, she said finally, whatever it costs. Together, he agreed, and the word felt, to both of them, like the beginning of something neither had quite dared to name aloud until now. That evening, Nathaniel called upon his solicitor, a careful gray-haired man named Edmund Talbot, who had served the Ashcombe family for nearly 30 years and had grown accustomed to his employer's occasional demands for absolute discretion. This time Nathaniel wanted the opposite. "I want every discrepancy laid out plainly," he said, spreading the compiled records across Talbot's desk, "not buried in legal language that only other solicitors can decipher. I want it written so clearly that any investor, any member of the public, any journalist who cares to look, can understand precisely how this venture's board has misled its shareholders." Talbot studied the records with growing concern, his expression shifting from cautious interest to genuine alarm as he traced the pattern Eleanor had first identified weeks earlier. "This is considerably more damning than I expected, Your Grace. If made public in full, it will end several careers, and likely result in criminal proceedings against at least 2 board members." "Good," Nathaniel said. "They accused an innocent woman of conspiracy to protect their own fraud. I intend to ensure the consequences fall where they belong." "And Miss Hartley's name? You understand that making this public will draw further attention to her involvement, regardless of how thoroughly we clear her of wrongdoing." "I understand that clearly," Nathaniel said. "Which is precisely why I intend to attach my own name to the report as prominently as hers, so that anyone reading it understands we uncovered this fraud together, as equals, and that any suggestion of impropriety on her part is as false as the venture's own accounts." Talbot regarded him for a long moment, something like surprise crossing his normally composed features. "In 30 years serving your family, Your Grace, I do not believe I have ever seen you attach your name so publicly to anything involving a woman's reputation." "No," Nathaniel agreed quietly. "You have not. Times change, Talbot. So, apparently, do dukes." The report was prepared within 2 days, compiled with the same meticulous care Eleanor had brought to every ledger she had ever managed, cross-referenced against public records and shipping manifests, until the fraud stood exposed beyond any reasonable dispute. Nathaniel arranged for it to be presented simultaneously to the venture's other shareholders, to the appropriate magistrates, and, at Talbot's careful suggestion, to a respected London newspaper known for its coverage of financial matters. Eleanor arrived at Corwood House the morning the report was to be delivered, her face pale with nerves despite her outward composure. "There is still time to reconsider," she said, watching him review the final pages one last time. "Once this is public, there is no undoing it, Nathaniel. Your name and mine will be linked in every drawing room in London, regardless of what conclusions people eventually draw." "I have no intention of reconsidering," he said, setting the papers aside to look at her directly. "I have spent 10 years avoiding exactly this kind of exposure, hiding behind careful courtships that demanded nothing real of me. I find, rather to my own surprise, that I no longer wish to hide." "And if it damages your standing, your family's reputation, then it damages it in service of the truth," he said. "I would rather stand exposed beside you than remain comfortably hidden without you, Eleanor. I have made my choice. I am asking whether you have made yours." She was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over with the same careful deliberation she brought to every column of disputed figures, weighing the risk against everything she had built and everything she stood to lose. "I made my choice the moment I agreed to bring my father's ledgers to this house," she said finally. "I simply had not yet admitted it to myself." He reached for her hand, and this time she did not hesitate before taking it, the two of them standing together as the messenger arrived to carry the report out into a London that would, within hours, be talking of little else. By evening, word had already begun to spread through the city's finest houses, carried by servants and solicitors, and the particular breed of gossip that traveled faster than any official announcement ever could. Lady Prudence arrived at Corwood House just as the last light was fading from the sky, her expression a mixture of concern and something that looked suspiciously like pride. "It is done then," she said, finding Nathaniel alone in his study, the empty desk before him a testament to the report that had already left his hands. "There is no undoing it now." "No," he agreed. "There is not. You understand what you have risked, Nathaniel. Not merely your standing with the Ventures Board, but your standing in society itself. Men will say you allowed a woman without fortune or title to influence your judgment in matters of business. Women will say far worse." "Let them say what they wish," he said. "I have spent 10 years shaping my life around what society might say, aunt, and it has brought me nothing but 30 failed courtships and a reputation I am not particularly proud of. I would rather be known as the Duke who stood beside the truth, and beside Eleanor, than remain comfortably respected for accomplishing nothing of real consequence. Prudence studied her nephew for a long moment, searching his face for the careful, guarded expression he had worn for as long as she could remember, and found instead something open and unguarded that she had not seen in him since he was a boy, long before the weight of his title had settled so heavily upon his shoulders. "Your father would be proud of you," she said quietly. "Not for the title you carry or the fortune you protect, but for this, for choosing what is right over what is merely comfortable." "I hope so," Nathaniel said, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he found that he believed it might actually be true. The scandal broke across London within a single day, spreading through drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs with the particular ferocity reserved for stories involving both a duke and a fraud. By the time Nathaniel and Eleanor understood the full scope of what they had unleashed, the Shipping Ventures Board had already begun their counterattack, and it was considerably more vicious than either of them had anticipated. Two board members, facing ruin and possible criminal charges, had apparently decided that their best remaining strategy was to destroy Eleanor's credibility entirely, painting her not as a wronged accomplice but as the true architect of the entire scheme, a woman who had supposedly manipulated the Duke of Corwood into lending his name and fortune to a false accusation meant to depress the venture's share price so that she and her unnamed conspirators could purchase shares cheaply before the truth emerged. It was, Nathaniel knew immediately, a transparent and desperate fabrication. But desperate fabrications, he had learned over 10 years in society, often traveled faster and further than careful truths. "They are calling her a fortune hunter," Talbot reported grimly, arriving at Corwood House with a stack of pamphlets already circulating through the city. Printed hastily and distributed by hands the board had clearly paid well. Worse than that, in some of these accounts, "There are suggestions that she seduced you deliberately, Your Grace, to gain access to your wealth and influence." Nathaniel read the pamphlet Talbot handed him with mounting fury, his hands tightening around the cheap paper until it crumpled beneath his grip. "This is libel, plain and simple." "It is," Talbot agreed, "but proving libel in court takes months, Your Grace, and by then, the damage to Miss Hartley's reputation may already be irreversible. These stories, once believed, are rarely fully undone, regardless of what truth eventually emerges." Nathaniel found Eleanor at her aunt's townhouse that afternoon, having already seen one of the pamphlets herself, her composure visibly strained beneath an expression she was clearly working hard to maintain. "I have been called many things in my life," she said, when he entered the parlor, "but never, until today, a seductress angling for a fortune. It is almost impressive, the creativity of it." "Eleanor, do not," she said, holding up a hand. "Do not apologize again, Nathaniel. I have heard enough apologies this week to last a lifetime. What I need now is a plan, not regret." He respected her too much to argue, and instead sat down across from her, forcing himself to think clearly through the fury still burning in his chest. "The report we submitted proves the fraud beyond reasonable doubt. The magistrates are already investigating the board's accounts. That much cannot be undone, regardless of what stories they invent about your character. But the investigation will take weeks, perhaps months, to reach any formal conclusion," Eleanor said. "And in the meantime, every drawing room in London believes I seduced a duke for his fortune. My aunt has already received 3 letters this week, canceling social engagements she has held for years." "Then we must move faster than the investigation," Nathaniel said, an idea beginning to take shape. "We must give London something more compelling than their lies to talk about. Something they cannot dismiss as easily as a printed pamphlet." "What do you propose?" "A public declaration," he said, "not merely of the truth about the fraud, but of my own intentions toward you, stated so plainly and so publicly that no one can credibly maintain the fiction they have constructed." Eleanor's breath caught, understanding dawning slowly in her expression. "You mean to announce a courtship, publicly, now, in the midst of all this?" "I mean to announce considerably more than a courtship," he said, "if you would have me." The words hung in the air between them, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of everything unsaid pressing against the quiet parlor. Eleanor rose from her chair, crossing to the window as she so often did when she needed distance to think clearly, though this time her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the sill. "You would propose marriage now," she said slowly, "in the middle of a scandal that has painted me as a fortune hunter. Do you understand how that will look, Nathaniel? They will say I orchestrated the entire fraud investigation, precisely to force your hand into marriage. They will say it regardless of what I do," he said. "I have learned, these past weeks, that there is no version of events careful enough to satisfy people determined to believe the worst. I would rather be married to a woman I love, facing whatever gossip follows, then remain single and cautious, watching you suffer alone for a truth we uncovered together. The word love settled into the room with a weight that seemed to still the very air around them. Eleanor turned from the window, searching his face for any hint of performance, any trace of the practiced charm that had once won and discarded 30 women before her, and found none. What she found instead was a man standing utterly exposed, offering her the truth of his heart without any of the careful distance he had guarded so fiercely for a decade. "You love me," she said, not quite a question. "I have loved you, I think, since the moment you told me my behavior on that terrace was sad rather than cruel," he said. "I did not recognize it at the time. I am not certain I entirely recognized it until this very moment, standing here, watching you decide whether you can trust me enough to weather this storm together." Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, 3 years of carefully guarded independence, suddenly feeling less like protection and more like a wall she had built to keep out precisely this kind of vulnerability. She thought of her father, of the patient way he had taught her to read figures honestly, to trust the truth of numbers over the comfortable lies people preferred to tell. She thought of 30 women who had come before her, each one discarded because Nathaniel Ashcombe had never found anyone willing to disagree with him, to challenge him, to see him clearly rather than simply admire his title. "I am frightened," she admitted. "Not of the gossip, not truly. I am frightened that if I say yes, if I let myself trust this completely, I will become nothing more than the 31st entry in a very long list." "You will never be an entry on any list," he said, crossing the room to stand before her. "You are the reason I finally understand why the other 30 never mattered. None of them ever asked me to be honest. None of them ever refused to curtsy to my title. None of them ever made me feel, even for a single moment, that I was known rather than merely admired. I am not offering you a courtship that might end in a season, Eleanor. I am offering you a life built on the same honesty that first drew me to you, for however long that life might last." Before she could answer, a sharp knock sounded at the parlor door, and Beatrice Farrow entered without waiting for a reply, her face pale with alarm. "Eleanor," she said, "you must see this immediately. It concerns the Ventures Board, and it is worse than anything we have yet faced." She held out a fresh pamphlet, and Eleanor took it with trembling hands, scanning the contents quickly, before her face drained of what little color remained. The board, in their final desperate attempt to escape consequences, had apparently decided to accuse Eleanor's late father directly, claiming that he himself had been complicit in an earlier fraud scheme, and that Eleanor had inherited both his shares and his supposed dishonesty. "They are attacking my father's memory now," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with a fury that had finally overtaken her fear. "A man who has been dead 3 years, who cannot defend himself, who taught me everything I know about honest dealing. They would destroy his name simply to save their own." "Then we will not let them," Nathaniel said, his own anger matching hers now. Cold and absolute. "I will have Talbot examine every record connected to your father's involvement in the venture, going back a decade if necessary, until we can prove beyond any doubt that he was as much a victim of this fraud as you and I. And I will make that proof as public as the accusation itself, in every paper willing to print it." "That could take weeks," Beatrice said. "Perhaps longer." "Then it will take weeks," Nathaniel said. "I do not care how long it takes, or what it costs. I will not allow a good man's memory to be sacrificed to protect criminals desperate enough to slander a woman and a dead father in the same breath." Eleanor looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw not the cold, detached Duke London had gossiped about for a decade, but a man willing to fight, publicly and completely, for her father's memory, as fiercely as he had fought for her own reputation. "Ask me again," she said quietly, "what you asked before Beatrice interrupted." Nathaniel's breath caught. "Eleanor Hartley, will you marry me? Not because scandal demands it, not because it would silence the gossips, but because I love you more completely than I believed myself capable of loving anyone, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that love, in whatever way you require, for as long as you will have me." "Yes," she said, the word emerging steady and certain despite the storm still raging beyond the parlor walls. "Yes, Nathaniel, I will marry you." He crossed the remaining distance between them and took her hands in his, and for a moment, the scandal, the pamphlets, the desperate lies of a board facing ruin, all of it faded into something distant and unimportant beside the simple, overwhelming fact of her answer. "We still have a great deal to face," she said, even as she allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, a genuine smile. "My father's name to clear, a board of criminals to bring to justice, an entire city of gossips to prove wrong. Then we will face it together," he said, echoing the promise they had made to each other days before, though it felt, now, considerably more solid than it had then, every part of it, until the truth stands so clearly that no one can doubt it any longer. Behind them, Beatrice watched with tears gathering in her eyes, the pamphlet still clutched forgotten in her hand, thinking of her brother, Eleanor's father, and how proud he would have been to see his daughter standing so firmly in her own truth, refusing to be diminished by lies, refusing to curtsy to anyone, even now, even in love. The weeks that followed tested every ounce of resolve both of them possessed. Talbot worked tirelessly through the venture's older records, tracing Eleanor's father's involvement back through years of correspondence and shipping manifests, until a clear picture emerged, one that showed a cautious, honest man who had invested modestly and asked pointed questions about the venture's practices long before his death, questions that had apparently made certain board members uneasy even then. "Your father wrote to the board directly, 3 years before he died," Talbot told Eleanor, spreading a set of recovered letters across the desk in Nathaniel's study. "He questioned discrepancies in their reported losses, the very same discrepancies you and the Duke uncovered independently, years later. He was, if anything, the first to suspect this fraud, not a participant in it." Eleanor read her father's careful handwriting with tears she did not try to hide, recognizing in his measured, precise questions the same instincts he had passed down to her, the same refusal to accept comfortable lies over honest figures. "He tried to warn them," she said softly, "and they silenced him instead, the same way they tried to silence us." "We will make certain his warnings are known now," Nathaniel said, standing beside her, publicly, alongside everything else. "Your father will be remembered as the man who first questioned this fraud, not as a participant in it." The revised report, complete with her father's recovered correspondence, was published within days, and its effect was immediate and decisive. The board members who had orchestrated the smear campaign against Eleanor found their own credibility collapsing entirely, their desperate accusations exposed as precisely the kind of fabrication Nathaniel had suspected from the beginning. 2 of them fled London before the magistrates could formally charge them. A third was arrested within the week, his assets seized pending trial. London's gossip, fickle as it always proved to be, shifted almost overnight. The woman once painted as a scheming fortune hunter became, in the space of a single news cycle, the clever daughter of an honest man who had first uncovered the fraud years before anyone else noticed, a woman whose intelligence and integrity had ultimately protected hundreds of investors from further losses. Lady Winterbourne, who had been among the first to spread suspicion about Eleanor's motives, found herself in the uncomfortable position of offering a stiff, insincere apology at a gathering neither Eleanor nor Nathaniel had particularly wished to attend. "I am pleased the matter has been resolved so satisfactorily," Lady Winterbourne said, her smile as thin and unconvincing as it had been at the Hartwell concert. "I confess, I never truly doubted your character, Miss Hartley." "Of course not," Eleanor said, with a politeness that did not quite mask the steel beneath it. "I am certain your friendly counsel was always offered with my best interests at heart." Nathaniel, standing beside her, allowed himself a small, private smile at the exchange, recognizing in Eleanor's measured response the same quiet strength that had first drawn him to her on that terrace, weeks and what felt like a lifetime ago. But even as the scandal resolved itself and the truth settled firmly in London's collective memory, Eleanor found herself facing a quieter, more private difficulty. Late one evening, as she and Nathaniel walked together through the gardens of Corwood House, she voiced the concern that had been building beneath her relief. "I have spent 3 years fighting to be seen as capable, as independent, as a woman who needed no man's protection to manage her own affairs," she said. "Now I am to become a duchess, Nathaniel, with all the expectations and constraints that title carries. I do not know how to reconcile the woman I have fought so hard to become with the role I am about to accept." He considered her words carefully before answering, understanding the weight behind them. "Then we will not reconcile them by forcing you to abandon one for the other," he said. "I did not fall in love with a woman willing to become quiet and decorative simply because she wears a title. I fell in love with the woman who argued with me over shipping manifests, who refused to soften her opinions for my comfort, who exposed a fraud that powerful men would have preferred remain hidden. I have no intention of asking that woman to disappear the moment she becomes my wife. Society will expect it regardless of your intentions. Society expected me to marry one of 30 interchangeable women who agreed with everything I said," he replied. "I have already proven myself willing to disappoint society's expectations, Eleanor. Rather publicly, in fact. I do not intend to stop now." She smiled at that, the tension easing slightly from her shoulders, though the deeper uncertainty remained, quiet but present. as they continued their walk beneath the darkening sky, both of them aware that the true test of his promise still lay ahead, in the quiet, ordinary days of marriage that would follow long after the scandal had faded from London's memory. The morning of the wedding arrived with a clear autumn sky, cold and bright, and Eleanor stood in the small dressing room of Corwood House, watching her hands tremble slightly as Beatrice fastened the final buttons of her gown. "You are not having second thoughts," Beatrice said, more statement than question, though a hint of concern colored her voice. "No," Eleanor said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that it was entirely true. "I am simply remembering how this began. A duke who could not keep a courtship past a single season, and a woman who told him, quite plainly, that his behavior was sad rather than cruel. And now you are about to become his duchess," Beatrice said, smiling. "The 31st, though I imagine no one will dare call you that to your face, given everything you have already survived together." Eleanor laughed, soft and genuine, the sound settling something anxious in her chest. "I do not mind the number, Aunt. I minded, once, the thought of becoming simply another entry on a very long list, but I have never once felt like an entry, not since that first afternoon in his study, arguing over shipping manifests. I have felt, every day since, like someone genuinely seen." Beatrice's eyes softened, and she reached up to smooth a stray curl from Eleanor's face, the same gesture she had used since Eleanor was a girl, long before her father's death, long before 3 years of fierce, lonely independence had hardened certain parts of her that were only now, slowly, beginning to soften again. "Your father would be so very proud," Beatrice said, "not because you are marrying a duke, Eleanor, though I imagine even he would have found some satisfaction in that, but because you found a man who values your mind as much as he values your heart, who fought publicly for your name and his memory both, and who has never once asked you to become smaller to fit comfortably beside him." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away, unwilling to disturb the careful work Beatrice had done on her face that morning. "I only wish he could see it himself." "Perhaps he does," Beatrice said gently. "In his own way." The wedding itself was a modest affair by the standards of Corwood House, held in the small chapel on the estate grounds, rather than the grand cathedral society might have expected for a duke's marriage. It had been Nathaniel's suggestion, offered without hesitation the moment Eleanor confessed she would prefer something quieter, more intimate, more true to the private nature of everything that had brought them together. Lady Prudence sat in the front pew, dabbing occasionally at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her earlier skepticism about her nephew's sudden devotion to Eleanor, long since replaced by genuine affection for the woman who had, in her own words, finally taught Nathaniel how to be honest with himself. When Eleanor walked down the short aisle toward the altar, she found Nathaniel watching her with an expression that held none of the careful, composed distance she remembered from that first night on the terrace. His eyes were bright, unguarded, filled with something that looked remarkably like wonder, as though he could not quite believe, even now, standing at the very threshold of their marriage, that she had chosen him. "You look," he said quietly, as she reached his side, "considerably less impressed with my title than you did the first time we spoke." "I have never been impressed with your title, Your Grace," she said, a smile playing at her lips. "I am, however, rather fond of the man beneath it." The ceremony passed in a warm blur of vows spoken plainly and sincerely, without the elaborate flourishes society might have expected, each word chosen with the same careful honesty that had defined their entire courtship. When the vicar finally pronounced them married, Nathaniel did not wait for any formal cue before drawing Eleanor into an embrace that drew soft, delighted laughter from the small gathered crowd, entirely unconcerned with the propriety such displays usually demanded. Before the guests moved out to the gardens for the wedding breakfast, a small commotion arose near the chapel doors, and Eleanor turned to see Talbot approaching with unusual haste for a man normally so composed, a folded letter in his hand. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace," Talbot said, addressing Nathaniel with a slight bow, though his eyes carried something urgent. "This arrived this morning from the magistrate's office. I did not wish to trouble you before the ceremony, but I thought you would want to know immediately." Nathaniel took the letter, scanning it quickly while Eleanor watched his expression shift from cautious concern to something closer to relief. "The third board member has been formally convicted," he said, looking up at her. "The court found sufficient evidence in our report, combined with your father's original correspondence, to secure a conviction on charges of fraud and conspiracy. The remaining 2 who fled London have been declared wanted men, their assets seized to compensate the investors they defrauded." Eleanor felt a weight lift from her chest that she had not fully realized she was still carrying. Her father's name, once threatened with the same accusations that had nearly ruined her own reputation, would now stand permanently vindicated in the public record. His careful, early warnings about the venture's dishonesty preserved as evidence of his integrity, rather than buried as evidence of guilt. "It is finished then," she said softly. "All of it." "All of it," Nathaniel confirmed, folding the letter and handing it to Talbot for safekeeping. "Though I confess, Talbot, your timing could not have been more perfectly chosen. I do not think I could have asked for a finer wedding gift." Talbot allowed himself a rare smile before retreating to let the couple continue their celebration, and Eleanor found herself laughing softly, the sound carrying equal parts relief and joy, as Nathaniel drew her toward the gardens where their guests waited. "Your father's name is cleared, permanently and publicly," he said as they walked. "I know it does not replace him, Eleanor, but I hope it offers some measure of peace." "It does," she said, her voice thick with emotion she no longer felt any need to hide. "More than I can properly express. Thank you, Nathaniel, not only for marrying me today, but for refusing to let his memory be buried beneath other men's lies. I would do it again," he said simply. "For him, and for you, without hesitation." The wedding breakfast that followed was equally intimate, held in the gardens of Corwood House among the last blooming flowers of the season, and it was there, amid the gentle clink of glasses and quiet conversation, that Lady Prudence rose to offer a toast that surprised nearly everyone present with its honesty. "My nephew," she began, "has spent 10 years courting 30 women, each one lovely, each one accomplished, each one entirely unable to hold his interest beyond a single season. I confess, I had begun to despair of ever seeing him settled, and had resigned myself to a lifetime of watching him retreat further into the comfortable, guarded distance he wore like armor." A ripple of soft laughter passed through the gathered guests, and Nathaniel, seated beside Eleanor, offered his aunt a rueful, good-natured smile. Then Eleanor Hartley arrived, Prudence continued, and told him quite plainly that his behavior was sad rather than cruel, and refused, from that very first moment, to curtsy to anything but his character. "I have watched my nephew change these past months in ways I never believed possible. He listens now, truly listens, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. He argues honestly, rather than retreating behind cold formality the moment he is challenged. He has become, in short, a man worthy of the extraordinary woman now sitting beside him, and I could not be more grateful, or more proud, to welcome her into this family." She raised her glass, and the assembled guests followed, and Eleanor felt Nathaniel's hand find hers beneath the table, warm and steady, as the toast settled around them like something solid and lasting. Later, as the afternoon light softened toward evening and the guests began to disperse into quiet conversation throughout the gardens, Eleanor found herself walking alone with Nathaniel along the same terrace where they had first spoken, months earlier, on the night he ended his courtship with the 30th woman in a decade of careful, guarded distance. "Do you remember this place?" she asked, pausing near the same stone urn where she had stood watching him that first night. "I remember every detail," he said. "I remember thinking you were the most infuriating woman I had ever encountered, and I remember not being able to stop thinking of you for days afterward, no matter how hard I tried. I remember thinking you were exactly as cold and careless as everyone claimed," she said, "and being entirely unprepared for how wrong I would prove to be." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I have spent this entire courtship trying to find the right way to thank you, Eleanor, for refusing to let me remain the man I was before you arrived. I do not think I have ever properly managed it." "You do not need to thank me," she said. "You did the harder work yourself, Nathaniel. I only refuse to flatter you. You were the one who chose, again and again, to become someone worth knowing." He drew her closer, and for a long moment they stood together on the terrace where it had all begun, the autumn light gilding the gardens around them. 30 failed courtships finally, fully, replaced by something neither of them intended to let go. "I love you," he said, "more completely than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone." "I love you too," she said, and meant it entirely, without a trace of the careful guardedness she had once wielded so fiercely to protect her own heart. Inside the house, Lady Prudence watched them through the tall windows, a soft, satisfied smile settling over her features as she turned to Beatrice, who had come to stand beside her. 30 women, Prudence said quietly, and he needed only one who would not curtsy. "The best ones rarely do," Beatrice replied, and together they watched Nathaniel and Eleanor Ashcombe, Duke and Duchess of Corwood, standing together on the terrace where their story had first begun, no longer strangers exchanging careful, guarded words in the dark, but partners, equals, and, at long last, each other's home. As evening settled fully over Corwood House and the last of the guests began their farewells, Eleanor slipped away for a quiet moment to the study, where she and Nathaniel had first bent their heads together over her father's ledgers, months earlier, when neither of them had understood what that simple, business-like arrangement would eventually become. The room looked much the same as it had that first afternoon, books lining the walls, maps spread across one corner, the fire burning low in the grate, though it felt entirely different to her now, warmed by memory rather than mere curiosity. She ran her fingers lightly across the edge of the desk where they had once argued over disputed figures, remembering the particular thrill of being taken seriously, of having her judgment weighed as carefully as any man's, by a duke who could have dismissed her opinion without consequence, and chose, instead, to value it. "I wondered where you had gone," Nathaniel said from the doorway, his wedding coat already loosened, his composure softened by the long, warm day behind them. "I wanted to see it once more," she said, "before we became simply Nathaniel and Eleanor, husband and wife, rather than the duke and the woman who refused to curtsy to him." "You will always be that woman," he said, crossing the room to join her. "Marriage does not erase who you were before it, Eleanor. If anything, I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain you never feel obligated to become anyone smaller than the woman who challenged me on that terrace." She smiled, leaning into him as his arms came around her, the fire casting warm light across the room that had witnessed the true beginning of everything between them. 30 women, she said softly, echoing his aunt's earlier toast, and you needed only one who would look you straight in the eye. One was all it ever needed to be, he said, provided it was the right one. Outside, the last carriages departed down the long drive of Corwood House, carrying guests back toward a London that would spend weeks, perhaps months, discussing the remarkable courtship of the Duke of Corwood and the clever, unyielding woman who had finally captured his heart. But inside the study, none of that mattered any longer, the noise and gossip of the city fading into something distant and unimportant beside the quiet, certain warmth of two people who had found, against every expectation, exactly what they had spent so long searching for without knowing its name. Eleanor Ashcombe, once merely Eleanor Hartley, a woman with no fortune and no particular interest in dukes, stood in the firelight beside her husband, and felt, for the first time in 3 long years of careful, guarded independence, that she had finally found someone worth trusting with the whole of her heart, someone who had earned that trust not through title or wealth, but through the slow, deliberate work of becoming honest, and open, and truly known. And Nathaniel, watching her in the firelight, understood at last why the 30 women before her had never mattered, why none of them had ever lingered in his memory past a single season. They had offered him admiration, when what he had needed, all along, was simply to be seen. A letter had arrived earlier that week, one Nathaniel had not yet mentioned to Eleanor, sealed with a modest crest she recognized the moment he finally drew it from his coat and offered it to her. "Lady Cordelia," Eleanor said, reading the name inscribed on the front. "Your 30th. "Open it," he said. "I read it myself and thought you should see it too, before we close this particular chapter of our lives together." Eleanor unfolded the letter carefully. Inside, in a neat, careful hand, Lady Cordelia had written a brief but gracious note, offering her congratulations on the marriage, along with a short reflection that surprised Eleanor with its warmth. She wrote that she had watched the scandal and its resolution unfold from a comfortable distance, and that she found herself, against any expectation of bitterness, genuinely glad the Duke had finally found a woman capable of holding his interest beyond a season. She confessed that in the months since their own courtship ended, she had come to understand that she, too, had never truly known him, had never asked the honest questions that might have revealed the lonely man beneath his composed exterior, and that she bore neither of them any ill will for finding, together, what she herself had never truly sought with him. "She was kinder than I expected," Eleanor said, folding the letter carefully. "She was always kind," Nathaniel said. "Kindness was never the trouble between us. I simply never gave her, or any of the others, the honesty required to build something lasting. That failing was entirely my own, Eleanor, long before you ever arrived to challenge it. Perhaps you might write back to her," Eleanor suggested, "not out of obligation, but simply as one honest correspondence deserves another." "I intend to," he said. "There is no reason our happiness should come at the expense of anyone else's peace, particularly not a woman who did nothing wrong beyond failing to challenge a man who desperately needed challenging." Eleanor set the letter aside and reached for his hand once more, feeling, in that small, quiet gesture, the full weight of everything their courtship had taught them both, not merely about each other, but about the kind of honesty required to build a marriage that might actually last beyond a single fleeting season. 30 courtships, she said softly, and a fraud besides. We have had a rather eventful beginning, Your Grace. I would not trade a single difficult moment of it, he said, drawing her close once more, if it led, in the end, to this. Outside, the stars had begun to emerge over the gardens of Corwood House, the same stars that had watched him end his courtship with Lady Cordelia on a terrace months before, the same stars that would now watch over a marriage built not on comfortable performance, but on the harder, rarer foundation of two people who had chosen, again and again, to see each other honestly, and to be equally honestly seen in return. 5 years passed, and the gardens of Corwood House had changed with them. New roses planted along the terrace where a duke had once ended his 30th courtship with careless, practiced ease, and where, not long after, he had first been challenged by a woman who refused to admire him simply because his title demanded it. Eleanor Ashcombe stood on that same terrace now, watching her 2 children chase each other across the lawn below, their laughter carrying up through the cool morning air. Her daughter, a sharp-eyed girl of 3 named Margaret after Eleanor's own mother, had inherited her father's dark hair, and, much to Nathaniel's private delight, her mother's stubborn refusal to accept an answer she did not find satisfying. Her son, barely a year old, slept soundly against the nursemaid's shoulder nearby, entirely unbothered by his sister's noisy games. She has asked the gardener 4 separate questions this morning, Nathaniel said, joining Eleanor at the balustrade, and rejected 3 of his answers as insufficiently thorough. She takes after her mother, Eleanor said, laughing. She takes after both of us, I think, he said. Though I confess I find myself grateful daily that she inherited your stubbornness rather than my old habit of avoiding difficult conversations entirely. Eleanor smiled and leaned against him, watching Margaret plant her small hands on her hips, apparently unsatisfied with the gardener's 4th attempt at an answer. It was a small moment, unremarkable in itself, but it settled something warm and certain in Eleanor's chest, the kind of quiet contentment she had once believed impossible for a woman so determined to guard her own independence. Their marriage had not been without its difficulties. In the years since that autumn wedding, there had been disagreements, occasionally sharp ones, about matters both large and small, from the management of the estate's finances, which Eleanor had insisted on overseeing herself, much to the initial discomfort of Nathaniel's more traditional relations, to smaller domestic questions about how best to raise children who would inherit both a great title and, Eleanor hoped fervently, an equally great sense of honesty about the responsibilities that title carried. But through every disagreement they had held to the same principle that had first drawn them together on that terrace years before: honesty over comfort, truth over flattery, and a fierce, mutual insistence on being fully seen by each other, rather than merely admired. The shipping ventures scandal had long since faded from London's active gossip, replaced by newer scandals and fresher intrigues, though its lasting effects remained. New regulations governing shareholder reporting had been enacted in Parliament, partly as a result of the public attention their case had drawn, protecting countless future investors from the kind of fraud that had once threatened both Eleanor's father's memory and her own reputation. Eleanor took quiet pride in that legacy, knowing her father's careful, early questions about the venture's accounts had ultimately helped reshape practices far beyond what either of them could have imagined at the time. Lady Prudence, now grayer but no less sharp-tongued, visited Corwood House frequently, delighting in her role as doting aunt to Margaret and her younger brother, and never missing an opportunity to remind Nathaniel, with evident satisfaction, how right she had been about Eleanor from that very first evening. "I told you she was refreshing," Prudence said, during one such visit, watching Margaret interrogate the gardener once more from the safety of the terrace. "I did not expect, however, that she would produce a granddaughter equally determined to argue with everyone she meets." "I would not have her any other way," Nathaniel said, and meant it entirely. Beatrice Farrow, too, remained a constant presence in their lives, her sharp wit softened somewhat by evident happiness at her niece's contentment, though she had never quite abandoned her habit of offering unsolicited commentary on London's latest gossip whenever she visited. She had grown particularly fond of young Margaret, spoiling her with stories of Eleanor's own childhood, tales of a girl who had once corrected her tutors on points of mathematics with the same fearless confidence her own daughter now displayed toward the estate's long-suffering gardener. Eleanor had also continued the work she had begun with her father's ledgers, though it had grown considerably beyond a single shipping venture in the years since her marriage. She now oversaw the finances of several charitable trusts established in her father's memory, using her sharp eye for figures and her fierce commitment to honest dealing to ensure that funds intended for widows and orphans of London's poorer districts reached their intended purpose without the kind of fraud and mismanagement that had so nearly destroyed her own reputation years before. Nathaniel, for his part, had thrown himself into work of his own, using his position in Parliament to advocate for the very reforms that had emerged from their scandal, earning a reputation among his peers not as the cold, detached duke of his earlier years, but as a thoughtful, occasionally stubborn advocate for policies that protected ordinary investors from the powerful men who might otherwise exploit them without consequence. "Do you ever think of them?" Eleanor asked one evening, as they sat together in the study that had witnessed the true beginning of their courtship, now comfortably worn with years of shared use. "The 30 women who came before me?" "Occasionally," Nathaniel admitted. "Though not with any regret, if that is what you are asking. I think of them mostly as reminders of who I once was, and how close I came to remaining that man forever, cold and guarded and entirely alone, surrounded by admiration that meant nothing at all. And now? Now I have you," he said simply, arguing with me over household accounts and refusing, even after 5 years of marriage, to simply agree with my opinions when you believe them mistaken. I could not have imagined, on that first terrace, how grateful I would eventually become for your stubbornness. Eleanor laughed, reaching for his hand across the desk, much as she had done that very first afternoon, though the gesture now carried the easy familiarity of years rather than the careful uncertainty of new acquaintance. "I could not have imagined, on that same terrace, that the cold duke ending his 30th courtship would eventually become the husband who reads bedtime stories to our daughter in 3 different silly voices, simply because she demands it. She has very particular standards," he said, with mock seriousness. "I dare not disappoint her." "She takes after her father in that respect too," Eleanor said, a fierce insistence on doing things properly, once he finally decides they matter. Outside, the sun began its slow descent toward evening, casting long golden light across the gardens where Margaret had finally exhausted the gardener's patience and moved on to interrogating her nursemaid instead, her small voice carrying up through the open window, bright and fearless and entirely unbothered by the great title she would one day inherit. Nathaniel watched his wife for a long moment, the woman who had once told him, plainly and without flattery, that his careless treatment of Lady Cordelia was sad rather than cruel, the woman who had refused to curtsy to his title on a moonlit terrace and had, in doing so, changed the entire course of his life. 30 women had come and gone before her, each one forgotten within a season, each one a testament to a man who had not yet learned what it truly meant to be known. Eleanor Hartley, now Eleanor Ashcombe, Duchess of Corwood, had taught him that lesson slowly, patiently, and honestly, refusing every comfortable lie he might have offered in its place, until the man who once feared he was incapable of lasting love had become, instead, a husband and father who could not imagine his life having unfolded any other way. 31, Eleanor murmured, watching their daughter's small, determined figure below, was always going to be the one who mattered, wasn't she? She was, Nathaniel agreed, drawing her close as the evening settled softly over Corwood House. She was always going to be the one who looked me straight in the eye, and never once looked away. That night, after the children had been settled and the household had grown quiet, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep, drawn instead to the small writing desk in their bedchamber, where she kept a modest collection of correspondence she had gathered over the years. Among the letters was one she returned to often, worn soft at its folds from repeated reading, the last her father had written to her before his death, filled with the same careful, patient wisdom he had offered her throughout her childhood. She read it again that night, by candlelight, while Nathaniel slept peacefully beside her, and found herself smiling at a line she had read perhaps 100 times before, one that felt more true now than it ever had. Her father had written that the measure of a life well lived was not the fortune one accumulated or the status one achieved, but the honesty one managed to preserve in a world that constantly rewarded convenient lies over difficult truths. He had hoped, he wrote, that she would find someone who valued that honesty as much as he did, someone who would rather hear her true opinion than a comfortable flattery. She folded the letter carefully and set it aside, glancing over at her sleeping husband, at the peaceful, unguarded expression he wore only in sleep, so different from the composed distance he had once shown the world. She thought of all the ways their marriage had tested that shared commitment to honesty, the arguments over estate management, the long, difficult conversations about how best to balance his political ambitions with the quieter demands of family life, the occasional sharp words exchanged when either of them retreated too far into old, guarded habits. None of it had been easy. But none of it, she reflected, had ever once required either of them to become smaller or quieter than they truly were. In the morning, she found Margaret already awake and dressed, sitting at the breakfast table with the fierce concentration of a child, determined to master her letters before her governess arrived. Nathaniel sat across from her, patiently guiding her small hand across the page, his composure entirely unbothered by the ink smudged across his own fingers from the morning's efforts. "Papa says I write my letters better than he did at my age," Margaret announced proudly, as Eleanor took her seat at the table. "Your father is prone to exaggeration where you are concerned," Eleanor said, though her smile betrayed her own pride in the observation. "I am prone to honesty," Nathaniel corrected, catching Eleanor's eye across the table with the same warm, unguarded affection that had become so familiar over the years. "Your mother taught me the difference, rather thoroughly, some years ago." Margaret looked between her parents with the particular curiosity of a child sensing a story she had not yet been told in full, though she would hear it eventually, in pieces, as she grew older. The story of a duke who had courted 30 women without once finding one willing to challenge him honestly, and the 31st, who had refused, from their very first meeting, to look away. For now, she simply returned to her letters, her small tongue poking out in concentration, entirely unaware of the terrace outside, the roses that had replaced the stone urn where her mother had once stood watching a stranger end a courtship with careless ease, or the long, difficult, honest road that had led her parents to this quiet morning table, ink-stained and imperfect and entirely, completely their own. Outside, the gardens of Corwood House stretched green and golden in the early light, unchanged in their essential shape from the night everything had begun, though everything within them had transformed completely, honest love having finally taken root where careful, guarded distance once stood alone.